Let's start with the hostages, Ryan. More hostages were released yesterday. We can put the A block up on the screen here. The truce, I guess if you could call it that, was extended 2 days, and 11 more hostages were freed yesterday. What did you make of some of this footage that was coming out yesterday of the Middle East, Ryan, of hostages being released?
Yeah, and what I think people who are hoping for is that this 2-day truce will lead to another 2 or 3 day truce, which leads to another one and can eventually reach to, get to some kind of long-term truce, because you're not going to get to a resolution, you're not going to get to justice at this point, because at the same time that this is unfolding, you have the complete collapse of all civilian infrastructure in Gaza. You've got more than 1.7 million people displaced. You have the water treatment facilities destroyed. You have sewage treatment facilities destroyed. You have people who don't have enough, remotely enough access to, let alone water, but food also. The healthcare system is completely destroyed. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand where that's going. Like, that leads directly to rampant disease. Cindy McCain actually is, now the head of the World Food Program, which I had forgotten, but she's been out warning that Gaza is approaching, famine conditions. There are only about 200 trucks of, containing humanitarian relief supplies getting in, and that's just not enough for a city of what used to be a city of 2 million people, but which is now a gigantic pile of rubble on which 2 million people are expected to survive.
And we have more from the New York Times. We can put this next graphic up on the screen here. The first round of hostages released as extended truce appears to hold. That's their headline. But if you're looking at this, if you're watching the show, you can see these figures here of the people who have passed away in captivity, the people who are 80 years old in captivity, 80 years and over in captivity, which we saw actually some of them being released, Israelis, yesterday, and getting jeered pretty brutally as they were released. We see here people 55 years and older, 18 to 54 and older. 11 Israeli hostages were released yesterday. And according to Reuters, Hamas had said earlier that it received a list of 33 Palestinians that were going to be released from Israeli jails in return for those 11 hostages. People probably remember that the Israeli stance on this was that they would extend the truce by 1 day for every 10 more hostages that were released. Ryan, where do you think that stands right now after yesterday?
I think that they're sorting out who and how they're going to move forward. Yeah. I do think that Hamas wants to continue releasing hostages. They certainly prefer that to a bombing rampage. They have essentially signaled that they would release all the hostages if there would be a kind of permanent ceasefire reached. Basically Israeli government is rejecting that, saying that no, like they're still committed to completely annihilating Hamas. The calculations of what that would take, though, at the current pace, there are various estimates of how many Hamas fighters they've killed at this point. I've seen estimates between 1,000 and 2,000. Others have said maybe up to 5,000. But you're talking about at least 13,000 people being killed, and people are saying it's likely, significantly higher than that. Yeah. So in order to kill 30 to 40,000 Hamas fighters and actually annihilate this, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of killed, and that's violently killed. That's before you get to the number of people dying by disease. But just as these hostage releases are putting kind of a global spotlight on the Hamas brutality of people over 80 in captivity, people under
Holocaust survivors,
survivors in captivity. The Israeli hostage release is similarly putting a spotlight on some of their brutality, and you're seeing children released who are allegedly caught up for throwing stones. Mostly women and children who are being held mostly without charges. Some convicted, some charged, but mostly not. And the way that they're being treated, and maybe we have this here, the way that they're talking about having been treated in Israeli detention is also shocking. Do we have this?
طب هذا مين حط لك اياه؟ هذا الصليب. هلا يعني؟ صوب كم تصور اصبع مش كسروا لك ايدك؟ ايدي واصبعي ومن هين رضة وظهري وكل شيء. ولا شيء ما قدموا ليش ولا شيء. طلعت من هين طلعت. طب هذا مين؟ وضع الأسرى ماتشوا ختاير يبقوا على الأرض يدعس عليهم قصي مش قصي كل شيء يعني أنا شاب بتحمل أما همي
يوم طلعونا على السيارة ضربونا وما رضيتش أوقع أوراق ضربوني أخرى قالوا لي وقع أوراق قلت لهم بعرفش لا أقرأ ولا أكتب وما رضيتش أوقع أوراق ويوم غذوني على الدكتور بس قالوا لي شو اسمك ضربوني عند الدكتور وبتفششوا بس في الأسرة قاعدين.
So just horrifying stories that we're hearing coming out of from the detainees, and then we're also winding up with this situation where the detainees or the former detainees are being told that they're not allowed to celebrate, not allowed to meet with people, not allowed to speak to the press.
As part of the deal.
As part of the deal, not allowed to celebrate struck me.
It's, actually, let's even get into this next clip because we see some of this kind of the sparks really starting to fly on this issue.
Let's Sky News, I believe. Yeah.
Right.
We understand that a teenager has been shot. Is this the right way to handle this situation, given that tensions are already rising and emotions are already quite high?
Well, we're talking about the release of attempted murderers. You call them children, but we're talking about teenagers who stabbed other teenagers. We're talking about...
That's not my question, Deputy Mayor. I totally and fully understand that they have been accused.
I'm giving you the context.
I understand, but if I can, Deputy Mayor, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm fully aware of...
I'm answering the
Deputy
question.
Mayor, I'm fully aware of what they've been...
Part of the deal was that there would be no celebrations. And the reason that these clashes are occurring is because exactly against the deal that there would be no celebrations celebrating the release of attempted murderers in East Jerusalem, in my city, where many people, many of the victims live side by side with the people who try to kill them. Part of the deal was that they would not have these celebrations. And if the clashes are occurring, it's exactly because of that.
Well, so that was the deputy mayor you heard there of Jerusalem speaking on Sky News. And Ryan, what you said earlier makes sense to me. It also makes sense to me that celebrations can fuel potential conflict in a way that, she's making a decent argument that that's what happened.
So it goes back to this talking point that we constantly hear that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, that's why it needs to be protected.
Right.
The only democracy in the Middle East would not insist that you cannot celebrate. Because you have to understand that's also in the context of laws they've implemented in the last several weeks that say you cannot, that there have been hundreds and even thousands of people arrested and jailed for posting just sympathy for people who've been killed in Gaza.
In fact, we talked about a journalist last week on the show who, and those were not sympathetic posts that she ended up being detained over. They were not, I wouldn't characterize them as sympathetic so much as I would characterize them as sympathetic with Hamas. They're sort of mocking people who had been taken hostage. But yes, she was detained.
Right. And then the idea that though, not only can you not celebrate, but you can't have family members come visit you after you've kind of left detention. It just really exposes or asks the question of what kind of democracy are we talking about here?
It's
this last democracy in the Middle East, or the only democracy in the Middle East. Also, why does Iraq get short shrift on this all the time? Lebanon has elections too. Didn't we create a democracy?
I thought we did that.
We did, yeah. And also they do have elections.
Are you saying the mission was not accomplished?
Mission was accomplished, clearly.
That's what I thought.
Anyway.
we needn't relitigate that. But no, I mean, I think it's legitimately a challenge because you do have a serious potential for a security situation to erupt, and obviously want to avoid that as much as possible so that you can get your own hostages back. And it's no easy feat, but obviously doing it while proving that you can live up to the standards of the sort of Middle Eastern democracy. I mean, it's important, obviously.
Right, and even if you have cut a deal with Hamas that there would be no celebrations, like the people who were released from prison were not part of that deal. They were just told that they were released from prison. And then if you're celebrating the fact that you've gotten your freedom, the other choice that the Israeli soldiers and Israeli police have is to not shoot them. Like you could also just let the celebration kind of wind down and people go home. Like that's an option that exists. Speaking of peace, the #1 Washington peacenik, Joe Biden, yesterday posted something extraordinarily controversial, which he is already walking back. But let's put this up here and I'll read this. Tell me what you make of this. Hamas unleashed, this is Joe Biden, Hamas unleashed a terrorist attack because they fear nothing more than Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace. To continue down the path of terror, violence, killing, and war is to give Hamas what they seek. We can't do that. You know, for the most part, this was my analysis from the very beginning, that Hamas, its brutal provocation was intended to create war, to undermine the extension of the Abraham Accords, and that Israel should not play into their hands by engaging in, as Biden calls it, terror, violence, killing, and war, and that we can't do that. That was because this was posted on Twitter, I think, and Biden is not used to making news on Twitter.
Yeah.
The American press largely skipped over this post from yesterday. Israeli press seized on it, was like, whoa, what on earth is Biden saying? Because Biden clearly seems to be referring to the Israeli action as terror, violence, killing, and war.
Yeah.
Which it is. It's terrifying, it's violent, it's killing, it's war.
It's war, right.
And so the Israeli press is saying, wait a minute, is Biden all of a sudden calling for a ceasefire and an end of the war?
Right.
No, he's not.
He walks it back.
He's now walking it back in, well, his aides are walking it back to reporters. Do we have, let me get your reaction and I'll find the exact quote.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, imagine it's your job to write these tweets for Joe Biden. I mean,
and you accidentally called for an end to war?
And you don't, and we're going to get into what Netanyahu talked about with Elon Musk recently and Elon Musk's trip to Israel, because actually Netanyahu was talking about a two-state solution, whether or not he supports the two-state solution.
But extremely important.
It's very relevant, right now. We're going to get into some of that in a second, but it is really relevant right now as we're talking about this post from Biden on X, because that is in contrast with the statement of the government, the stated position of the government of the country who is reliant on our aid in this situation. I don't mean our money, but certainly our munitions. There are plenty of quotes from Israeli government officials in the Israeli press about how devastating it would be to lose the support of America in the war specifically because of munitions and those types of resources. It's less about, we're about 20%, and in a normal year we make up about 20% of their military budget. So significant, not make or break, but the munitions are absolutely critical. And so it's really strange to see that ostensible contradiction between our position and Netanyahu's position. You've made an interesting point repeatedly about how Biden, you made this point on Twitter yesterday, I saw. I think you were arguing with Ben Dreyfus, and you were talking about how Biden's strategy seems to be a public stance that allows him to pressure Netanyahu privately. But we don't know. I mean, we honestly have no idea.
That's what he claims, right.
Right.
We don't know what's happening behind the scenes. But yes, that's what Biden has been saying, that he's kind of alluded to it a little bit. When he was asked about conditioning aid, whether you should condition aid to Israel based on whether or not they're committing human rights abuses, he said the other day, that's an interesting thought, and it's something we should consider. That's the furthest an American president has gone since, well, back in the 80s, the posture even of the Reagan administration was further to the left than we're in now. But in this new era, that's a step that hasn't been taken before. And then Biden said, if I had started by saying that, then he basically said that I wouldn't have been able to develop the wiggle room privately to force this kind of truce and this hostage deal. The problem with that claim of his is that Hamas was putting this on the table from the very beginning. And the President of the United States can, with a phone call, force Israel to take these deals. They did it in 1982 with Lebanon. Biden himself did it in 2021 with Gaza. Like, you can make these phone calls, and by the end of the phone call, the Israeli prime minister agrees to truces. Like, that's how this works. So it could have happened. So he didn't need to actually do this, but that is his claim. Now, here's the cleanup on his his peacenik tweet. This is to Jewish Insider. This is a White House aide. He meant that we can't lose hope for peace. So we don't want to lose hope. Not that he wants or demands peace or is going to use his power to actually bring about peace. We can't lose hope for peace. So he meant that we can't lose hope for peace ultimately in the region. So ultimately, sometime in the future, that it's still incredibly important that we continue to lay the groundwork for and create the conditions for a lasting peace. And that involves a two-state solution.
Yeah.
And so let's get to the next two elements here, which are quite relevant to this. First is Ben-Gvir.
Yep.
The far right doesn't even begin to describe him, but he represents a hard right settler kind of bloc in Netanyahu's government. If we can put this one up here, Ben-Gvir basically he says, if you don't hurry up and restart this war, I'm going to bring the government down.
And he's the national security minister.
Yeah, and now Gvir could leave the government, and if everyone else stayed, Netanyahu would have enough support to stay. Mm-hmm. But Gvir is not alone in his hawkish approach to this. Now, the counter-argument that Netanyahu has been making to the right, and this is the argument that he's been making for years that we refuse to hear in the United States. Let's put up this quote from Bibi Netanyahu. He told his cabinet essentially, quote, "I am the only one who will prevent a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank after the war." So that is Netanyahu's argument for why he should be prime minister. That is what he effectively ran on
this is just
when he
yesterday,
became
by the way.
prime minister. Right, this is yesterday.
Fresh quote. That's from yesterday. While
Right.
Joe Biden is posting the tweet that he posted.
Right, saying that Biden insists that everything they're doing is in furtherance of a two-state solution, while Netanyahu has been very publicly and openly saying he does not support a two-state solution. And the reason, and he has said this in the past, the reason that he bucked up Hamas was because Hamas makes it more difficult for Palestinians to get to statehood. So we are at a place where we're, like, I think the word gaslighting is overused, but when you see the contradiction in these public statements, it's kind of staring you at the face. I think it's appropriate to finally use that.
Well, the word quagmire is underused in American foreign policy, and that's where this is headed from my perspective. As again, I know a lot of our audience disagrees with me on the question of Israel. I'm generally supportive of Israel and take a different position on this, although I have plenty of problems with the way they've prosecuted this war and the way that they've chosen to run their country. But even so, we're headed to a situation where you have right now a completely different endgame for the government that Joe Biden is supporting. If their endgame is openly on November 27th, no Palestinian state, and Biden is saying on the one hand, I'm two-state solution, Mr. Two-State Solution here, which has long been his approach to this, and it's something that he's touted, then what does it mean to eradicate Hamas? What does it mean to destroy Hamas? What does it mean to eliminate Hamas? Seriously, tell me, because I don't think we have any answers to that question. What have you done so far? We actually don't know, to your point that you made earlier. We don't know a breakdown of Hamas and civilians. We don't know the extent of the damage to the Hamas military and government operation, the terrorist operation. It's extremely hard to say. And at the same time, now, because of what Biden has said, there are some people in Israel, actually left and right, who are looking at it and saying, Ben-Gvir, bring the government down, because we can't have a ceasefire right now that's prolonged indefinitely into the future. We will not sufficiently eliminate, or we will not sufficiently harm Hamas's military operation. They don't believe that Hamas's military operation has gotten its sort of necessary comeuppance, and I mean that in a pragmatic sense as much as a moral sense for what they did on October 7th. And so these are huge tensions. The CIA director, William Burns, apparently he's been taking a leading role in negotiations. He was in Israel talking to the Mossad head yesterday and trying to negotiate further with Hamas, but that only goes so far when you have dramatically different end games. And that to me feels like a quagmire.
Right, or yes. And the folks like Ben-Gvir are very clear that they have absolutely no interest in giving up the West Bank. Like they have
absolutely not. They
have seized vast portions of it, and they do not plan on either slowing down the settlements or slowing down the expulsions, or what peace would take, which is actually rolling back settlements, the land for peace. And when it comes to Gaza, they've been also very clear, like that there are significant elements of the Israeli government say we should just clear it out, and turn it into Israeli settlements.
And our government is funding, supporting a war that the government we're supporting has a completely different end game, as opposed to what our position is on this.
Well, our public position, at least, we're not that stupid, though, are we?
If our position is a two-state solution, and this is the government, the head of the government that we're supporting is saying something basically completely different than that.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.